Darkness settles over a city that never truly sleeps, a city built on ambition, fear, and the thin line between survival and dominance. In the quiet hours before dawn, New York feels like a beast with 100 eyes, some watching, some hiding, all remembering. And somewhere inside that living machine of shadows and neon, the name Lucky Luciano still moves through the air like a whisper, a threat, a myth. Long after his death, the echoes remain. Because Luciano didn't just build an empire, he built a system. A blueprint for power that shifted the underworld from chaos to calculation. But the true secret of his rise wasn't violence. It wasn't intelligence alone, or charm, or daring. It was loyalty, raw, weaponized, manipulated with precision. To understand his impact, you must understand the architecture of loyalty he crafted. Not loyalty born from love or tradition, but loyalty shaped by fear, opportunity, and psychological mastery. Luciano discovered early what most criminals never learn, that a man's loyalty can be engineered. It can be bought, traded, destroyed, and rebuilt, all depending on who controls the incentives. And so, the story begins not with bloodshed, but with the quiet realization that in the American Mafia's golden age, loyalty was more powerful than any bullet. Every gangster carried a gun, only Luciano carried a vision. A vision that would lead him to rewrite the rules of organized crime. The city of the 1920s was cracked by corruption, trembling with ambition. Immigrant families fought for scraps, while political bosses sold influence behind closed doors. Prohibition had turned liquor into gold and criminals into businessmen. Yet even as gangs grew richer, their world remained unstable, unpredictable. Loyalty was fragile, often temporary. Bosses lived in fear of betrayal, soldiers lived in fear of their bosses. It was a hierarchy of paranoia, built on ego and tradition. Into this fractured world stepped a young man who understood that power required structure, discipline, and trust, not the sentimental kind but the strategic kind. He knew that fear alone couldn't sustain loyalty, fear only created rebels. What he needed was a network of men who were loyal because it benefited them, because betrayal cost more than obedience. A system where alliances were not just emotional bonds but calculated investments. This documentary begins with the moment Luciano recognized that truth. He wasn't born into power. He clawed toward it, observing the flaws in every boss he served under. They demanded loyalty but never earned it. They trusted tradition but never questioned it. They clung to old-world customs that blinded them to new-world realities. Luciano saw opportunity in that blindness. He realized that the Mafia could become bigger, more efficient, more profitable, if its loyalty structure was rebuilt from the ground up. Imagine the camera slowly moving across a smoky backroom, where gangsters speak in hushed voices, each one deciding whom to trust and whom to fear. Luciano moves among them quietly, not the loudest, not the most violent, but the one watching everything. The one already thinking 10 steps ahead. His silence was strategic. His charm was dangerous. People liked him and that made him deadly. Because the men who laughed with him would soon become the foundation of his empire, or the first casualties of his rise. The story unfolds like a slow-burning thriller, exploring how Luciano transformed loyalty into his greatest weapon. Not through promises but through results. He recognized talent, rewarded ambition, and punished failure with cold precision. He built alliances that seemed impossible, crossing ethnic lines that the old guard considered sacred. He connected worlds that had previously lived in conflict. Irish, Jewish, Italian, he didn't care about origins. He cared about ability. He cared about loyalty. And he cared about winning. But every ascent comes with shadows. Every alliance hides a potential betrayal. Every loyal follower carries a fear they don't speak aloud. Luciano's story is one of constant balance. Trust versus control, friendship versus ambition, brotherhood versus survival. Even the men closest to him lived in a state of unspoken tension, grateful for his leadership, terrified of disappointing him. As the film opens, the tone is both grand and intimate. We explore the psychological underpinnings of power, the unspoken code of men who live outside the law, the emotional weight of loyalty that isn't love but obligation. We step into a world where alliances are forged with handshakes but secured with blood. Where a favor today can become a death sentence tomorrow. Where the wrong whisper can topple an empire. And in the center of it all stands Luciano. Charismatic, calculating, impossible to fully understand. Was he a visionary or a tyrant? A unifier or a manipulator? A leader shaped by loyalty or a predator who exploited it? That's the journey ahead. A journey through a man's rise and downfall, through the psychology of power, through the hidden mechanisms of criminal loyalty that shaped not only the Mafia but modern organized crime around the globe. This is not just the biography of a gangster. It is the anatomy of an empire built on promises, fear, opportunity, and betrayal. The camera fades from the dark cityscape to the cold light of dawn as his story truly begins. A story where every alliance has consequences, and every act of loyalty has a price. Because in Lucky Luciano's world, loyalty wasn't just a virtue. It was a weapon. Before Lucky Luciano ever stepped onto the stage of American crime, the world he would one day dominate was a chaotic battleground. A fractured universe ruled by men who clung to old traditions, violent impulses, and the kind of pride that blinded them to the changing tides of the new century. New York City itself was swelling with immigrants chasing dreams, but underneath that crowded hope was a darker, more desperate reality. Families packed into tenements, gang wars erupting in the streets, and a rising criminal economy built on instinct rather than strategy. In those early decades, the Mafia in America was not yet the sleek, organized machine history remembers. It was messy, unstable, divided. Italian gangs fought not as one force, but as scattered clans carrying the weight of old Sicily on their backs. Feuds that began in distant villages followed them across the ocean, taking root in the slums of Manhattan. Bosses were shaped not by intelligence or vision, but by their willingness to kill without hesitation. Violence was immediate, unpredictable. Alliances were shallow and temporary. A wrong glance, a misplaced word, or a shift in loyalty could spark bloodshed that lasted years. At the same time, other ethnic groups, Irish mobs, Jewish syndicates, and various street gangs, were battling for their own territories. There was no central authority, no rules, no guiding system to keep the underworld from tearing itself apart. The newspapers described the era as a criminal free-for-all, a time when every block seemed to have its own warlord. Corruption thrived because chaos thrived. Politicians played favorites, cops took bribes from every side, and ordinary people lived with the constant fear that the streets outside their door could erupt at any moment. This was a world ruled by ego, not strategy. Most bosses didn't understand the value of cooperation. To them, power meant standing alone, feared and isolated. Friendship was weakness. Compromise was shameful. Unity was unthinkable. They carried their pride like a loaded gun, ready to fire at anyone who challenged their authority. In that environment, loyalty was a flimsy thing. More superstition than system, more illusion than reality. Men swore loyalty on Sunday and broke it by Monday. Betrayal was not shocking, it was expected. And then came Prohibition, a law meant to cleanse America of sin that instead turned crime into an empire. Overnight, alcohol became the most profitable commodity in the country, and bootlegging transformed small-time criminals into wealthy entrepreneurs. But even with this new river of money, the underworld remained disorganized. Gangs hijacked each other's shipments, murdered each other's drivers, burned down each other's warehouses. Millions were being made, and millions were being lost to reckless violence. A smarter man could see the potential for something greater. A man with vision could turn chaos into order. But no such man existed yet. Those who ruled at the time were bound by the traditions of the past. They followed the old Sicilian codes with a rigidity that made them predictable and defenseless against new challenges. They mistrusted innovation, despised outsiders, and clung to rivalries that weakened them. Even the Mafia bosses refused to work with other ethnic groups, believing purity mattered more than profit. Their world was small, enclosed, and destined to collapse under its own stubbornness. As the camera moves through the alleyways of 1910s and 1920s New York, you can almost feel the tension in the air. The streets are loud, overcrowded, but beneath the noise is a sense of something waiting, an underworld on the edge of transformation. The viewer senses it too. This world cannot survive as it is. Something must change. Someone must rise. And that rising figure would be someone unlike the bosses who came before him. While most gang leaders were aging men stuck in the traditions of the old country, a new generation of street kids was growing up in the melting pot of American life. They were shaped not by Sicilian villages but by New York's ruthless hustle. They saw opportunity where the old guard saw danger. They understood Americans, understood the police, understood the shifting tides of business. They were hungry, bold, and far more adaptable. Among those young men was a boy named Salvatore Lucania, the child who would one day become Lucky Luciano. But at this moment in history, he was still just one of many faces lost in the blur of poverty and crime. No one knew what he would become. No one knew his name would define an era. But the conditions that would shape him were already in motion. Corruption rising like smoke, rivalries turning bloodier, and prohibition about to open doors that had never existed before. The underworld was a broken puzzle. No one had the vision to assemble it. No one had the intelligence to connect its pieces. No one had the courage to bridge its ethnic divides. And because of that failure, power remained scattered like shards of glass, dangerous, sharp, and impossible to hold. But the world was changing. The streets were changing. America itself was changing. And in that shifting landscape there was room for someone new. Someone who could see patterns where others saw chaos, someone who could turn violence into strategy, someone who understood that loyalty didn't have to be inherited, it could be engineered. The world before Luciano was a storm without a captain. And storms, sooner or later, produce their own leaders. Someone always rises. Someone always takes control. And soon that someone would be Lucky Luciano. Every empire begins with a child, and every legend begins long before anyone recognizes it. Long before Lucky Luciano became a name spoken with fear and admiration, he was just Salvatore Lucania, another immigrant boy trying to survive the brutal streets of New York. But even in those early years, something in him was different. A sharpness in his gaze, a confidence in his walk, a refusal to accept the life that seemed predetermined for boys like him. He arrived in America with his family, carrying little more than hope and the weight of a world they had left behind. The Lower East Side swallowed immigrants whole in those days. Tenements stacked families like crates, the air thick with sweat, smoke, and desperation. Children learned early that dreams were fragile things, too easily crushed by hunger or violence. But for young Salvatore, hardship became a kind of training. Every fight, every insult, every moment of fear carved something into him. Resilience, calculation, ambition. He discovered quickly that the streets rewarded boldness. He learned English faster than most boys his age, not because he loved the language, but because he understood instinctively that words were weapons just as powerful as fists. While other kids were intimidated by the gangs that roamed the alleys, Salvatore studied them. He watched how they moved in groups, how they controlled territory, how they commanded respect. Power fascinated him, not the fantasy of it but the mechanics behind it. When he fought smart. When he spoke confidently. He earned the nickname Lucky after surviving a series of dangerous encounters. Some exaggerated, some true, all contributing to the myth that would follow him for decades. But those close to him knew the truth. Luck had little to do with it. Luciano created opportunities where others saw danger. He anticipated threats before they arrived. He made choices that seemed reckless but were calculated down to the smallest detail. One of the pivotal moments of his youth came when he realized he had no interest in being a pawn in someone else's game. Most boys joined gangs to belong. Lucky joined gangs to learn. He drifted between groups, absorbing everything: how leaders commanded fear, how they lost control, how loyalty was earned or broken. He watched men die for pride, for territory, for mistakes that could have been avoided. He understood even then that real power required structure and strategy, not ego. In school he was restless. The rigid system bored him. The streets taught faster, sharper lessons. It wasn't long before he dropped out entirely, embracing the life he had always known awaited him. But unlike others who stumbled blindly into crime, Lucky saw it as a career. A path. A future he could shape with his own hands. As a teenager he began charging boys in the neighborhood for protection. 5 or 10 cents to keep bullies away. It was small, almost innocent, but it revealed something profound about him. He understood value exchange. He didn't intimidate, he negotiated. He didn't threaten, he offered solutions. Even then his charisma was disarming. People trusted him even when they feared him. Then came Meyer Lansky. Their meeting seems almost faded in hindsight. A quiet Jewish boy and an ambitious Italian kid, both sharp, both hungry, both possessing a mind far older than their years. Lansky saw something in Lucky immediately: discipline, leadership, potential. Lucky saw something equally valuable in Lansky: intelligence, loyalty, a mind that could match his own. Together they formed a bond that defied ethnic boundaries and that would one day reshape the criminal world. In many ways, Lansky became the mirror Lucky didn't know he needed. Someone who thought like him, challenged him, refined him. Lucky's early years were also marked by violence that shaped him psychologically. He saw friends stabbed in alleys, witnessed families torn apart by addiction and poverty, watched police treat immigrants like animals. He learned that the world didn't value fairness. It valued strength, cunning, and survival. These lessons hardened him, but also sharpened him. He was arrested multiple times in his youth, mostly for petty crimes, yet each arrest taught him how the system worked. He learned how to talk to police, how to stay silent when necessary, how to judge who could be bribed and who couldn't. The legal system became another puzzle to master, another arena where intelligence mattered more than brute force. As he grew older, Lucky became known for something unusual in the criminal world: balance. He was ruthless when he needed to be, yet calm under pressure. He could smile during negotiations and strike with deadly force minutes later. He wasn't controlled by anger or emotion the way others were. He operated like a businessman trapped in the body of a gangster, always thinking 2 or 3 seasons ahead. Every decision he made as a street kid planted the seeds of the empire he would one day build. He cultivated relationships with different communities. He learned the value of alliances. He understood that loyalty wasn't something you demanded, it was something you engineered through opportunity and trust. But perhaps the most important transformation came in the way he viewed himself. For many immigrants, the American dream meant escaping poverty. For Lucky, it meant transcending the limits imposed by birth, ethnicity, and tradition. He didn't want a house or a steady job. He wanted influence, control, legacy. A turning point arrived the day he realized he could no longer remain just another soldier in someone else's crew. The bosses he worked under operated on fear and superstition, clinging to outdated ideas that limited their growth. Lucky saw the flaws clearly. He saw their blind spots, and he knew he could do better. He understood something the older generation refused to accept: America was not Sicily. This was a different battlefield, a different culture, a different opportunity. The old rules wouldn't survive here. To thrive, the Mafia needed innovation, modernization. Someone willing to break traditions and rebuild the system from the ground up. That someone, he knew, would be him. Before anyone else saw it, before his name carried weight, before he commanded armies, Lucky Luciano already believed he was destined to rise. Not by chance, not by luck, but by design. And the streets of New York, harsh as they were, had prepared him perfectly for what would come next. Long before the world understood what he was doing, Lucky Luciano was quietly rewriting the rules of the criminal underworld. His genius was not in violence, though he could be ruthless when needed. It was not in charm alone, though he possessed plenty of it. His real breakthrough came from a simple, radical idea: that in America old-world divisions were obsolete. Power did not belong to those who clung to tradition. Power belonged to those who could build alliances others considered impossible. The Mafia of that era was trapped in its own cage, an ethnic island refusing to mix with the outside world. The Italian bosses believed purity equaled strength. They believed alliances with Jewish or Irish mobsters were beneath them, a sign of weakness. But Lucky saw what they could not. This was America, a nation where opportunity grew from diversity. A nation where every ethnic group had something valuable to offer. A nation where money didn't care about bloodlines. He saw power where others saw threats. The first alliance he forged was the one that changed everything. His friendship with Meyer Lansky had begun in childhood, but by their teenage years it had matured into something far more powerful: a strategic partnership. Lansky was brilliant, quiet, disciplined, with a calculating mind that could see patterns like a master chess player. He didn't believe in unnecessary violence. He believed in profit. And he believed in Lucky. Together they saw an underworld divided by hate and pride. They saw gaps between ethnic groups that could be bridged. They saw a future where alliances created stability, where cooperation created profit, where loyalty was built through shared ambition rather than heritage. It was an idea so modern, so innovative, that it threatened the very foundations of the Mafia's identity. Lucky began reaching out, not boldly but carefully. Conversations in dim back rooms, handshakes in crowded nightclubs, whispered agreements behind cigar smoke. He approached the Jewish syndicates, the rising stars of the criminal world, recognizing their financial genius and their efficiency. Men like Lansky and Bugsy Siegel understood business in a way the old Italian dons never could. They didn't care about ancient feuds or rigid codes. They cared about results. Bugsy Siegel was a force of nature, handsome, unpredictable, violently charismatic. He and Lucky connected not through similarity, but through mutual respect. Bugsy admired Lucky's calm intelligence. Lucky admired Bugsy's raw aggression, which he saw as a weapon he could direct. Together with Lansky, they formed an alliance that would become the backbone of Luciano's rise. But these partnerships weren't just social bonds, they were strategic masterpieces. Each ethnic group had strengths others lacked. The Italians had tradition, networks, and heritage. The Jews had financial acumen, connections, and discipline. The Irish controlled political doors, police departments, and unions. Lucky understood that combining these strengths would create something unstoppable. To build these alliances, he had to defy the very men who held power over him. The old Sicilian bosses despised the idea of mixing with outsiders. They saw it as betrayal. But Lucky had something they didn't: the vision of a future where the Mafia was not a small circle of clannish men, but a national enterprise. He began by proving the value of collaboration. Bootlegging operations ran smoother when Jewish syndicates supplied intelligence and logistics. Nightclubs thrived when Irish cops were paid to look the other way. Money flowed faster, cleaner, with cooperation than it ever had under isolation. And with every successful operation, Lucky's influence grew. Still, there was resistance. Some Italian bosses were furious. They confronted him, threatened him, attempted to intimidate him back into the old model. But Lucky remained calm. He didn't challenge them directly, he let the results speak for themselves. Money talks louder than tradition. And the numbers were undeniable. But forging these alliances required more than strategic thinking. It required emotional intelligence, something Lucky had in abundance. He knew how to read people, how to give them just enough trust to feel valued, just enough fear to stay loyal. He understood that the greatest power wasn't in commanding obedience, but in inspiring belief. His partners didn't follow him because he demanded it. They followed him because they saw his vision and wanted to be part of it. Slowly, the underworld transformed. Meetings that were once unimaginable, Jewish, Irish, Italian leaders sitting together, began to happen with Lucky at the center. Deals were struck. Territories divided. Responsibilities assigned. What had once been a loose collection of violent factions was becoming something organized, structured, efficient. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It took patience, charm, and the willingness to challenge centuries of cultural hostility. It took late-night conversations where trust was built word by word. It took demonstrations of force when necessary, because not everyone welcomed the new order. Some men had to be convinced permanently. Luciano understood the cost of innovation. He understood the price of unity. But the alliances he built, the forbidden alliances, were the cornerstone of everything that followed. They allowed him to rise above every rival. They gave him access to resources no Italian boss had ever controlled. They gave him influence across ethnic lines, across neighborhoods, across entire industries. Through these alliances, he discovered the true nature of loyalty. It was not inherent, not cultural, not guaranteed. It was crafted. It was earned. It was a product of mutual benefit and shared ambition. And once he understood that, he began using loyalty as a tool, a weapon, a strategy. Men followed him not because he shared their blood, but because he shared their vision. This was the moment Lucky Luciano stopped being a street-smart gangster and became a visionary architect of organized crime. His alliances, controversial, dangerous, brilliant, were the spark that ignited the transformation of the American underworld. Before him, crime was fragmented. After him, it was unified. Before him, bosses ruled through fear. After him, they ruled through networks. Before him, loyalty was inherited. After him, loyalty was engineered. The world didn't know it yet, but the rise of Lucky Luciano had truly begun. And everything that came next, every triumph, every betrayal, every war, would grow from the alliances he dared to create when no one else would. The forbidden alliances that changed everything. Long before the Mafia became a polished empire, its foundation rested on something ancient, something older than any American city, the Code of Omerta. A code of silence. A code of honor. A code meant to bind men together through loyalty deeper than blood. But by the time Lucky Luciano emerged, Omerta was no longer functioning the way it was intended. It had become rigid, symbolic, recited but not respected, feared but not fully understood. Men swore loyalty to their bosses while secretly plotting against them. The code was crumbling under the weight of hypocrisy and self-preservation. Luciano saw this flaw with unsettling clarity. The world around him was changing. America was not Sicily. The streets were louder, the temptations stronger, the opportunities greater. Silence alone could not guarantee loyalty. Tradition alone could not guarantee obedience. He realized that for Omerta to survive, and for him to rise, it needed to evolve. It needed to become practical, not ceremonial. It needed to function as a psychological system, not merely a cultural expectation. So he began to reimagine the code from the inside out. Luciano understood something fundamental about human nature. People follow those who benefit them. Loyalty grows when it is rewarded. Silence is maintained when speaking becomes too costly. He didn't try to preserve the old sacred version of Omerta. No, he modernized it, weaponized it, turned it into a transactional system where loyalty was no longer a moral duty but a strategic necessity. He replaced blind obedience with mutual obligation. If he asked something of a man, he made sure that same man gained from it. Protection, money, influence, whatever incentive kept him loyal. He created a world where betrayal wasn't just dishonorable, it was irrational. For the first time in Mafia history, loyalty became measurable. He also eliminated the emotional chaos that plagued the old bosses. Fear alone had been their tool, but fear, Luciano knew, had limits. A man afraid of you will obey, but only until someone else offers a safer path. A man loyal to you through opportunity will think twice before turning. A man who owes you favors is tied to you in ways far stronger than threats. Imagine him sitting in a smoky backroom, explaining his philosophy with calm confidence. A man who depends on you will protect you. A man who respects you will follow you. A man who fears you will wait to betray you. Those words, spoken softly, carried more truth than any oath. But modernization didn't mean forgiveness. If someone broke the code, if someone talked, betrayed, or disrespected, the punishment was absolute. Luciano's new omerta was both flexible and unforgiving. He removed the messy cruelty of the old world and replaced it with something colder, more predictable. Betrayal wasn't met with rage, it was met with procedure. Execution became a matter of business, not emotion. That predictability made the code stronger. Men knew exactly what breaking omerta would cost them. Under his influence, the Mafia's internal structure began shifting. Soldiers weren't just workers, they were assets. Capos weren't just enforcers, they were managers. The higher-ups weren't distant monarchs but decision-makers who rewarded loyalty through opportunity. Omerta evolved into a corporate-style confidentiality agreement, reinforced not by sacred words but by strategic design. Luciano also understood the value of secrets. He believed that shared secrets were the strongest form of loyalty. A man who knows dangerous information about you is also vulnerable to you. A man whose success depends on your continued survival becomes invested in protecting you. This reciprocal entanglement created a web of interdependence, each man tied to the next, their fates woven together. And so, loyalty in the Luciano era wasn't about emotion or ideology. It was about architecture. He built a system where every man had something to lose. Where every member of the family had a role, a responsibility, and a calculated stake in keeping the machine running. Loyalty was no longer abstract. It was engineered. But omerta also had a psychological component, and Luciano mastered it with the precision of a strategist. He knew how to inspire loyalty through respect, something rare in his world. Men admired him because he listened, because he rewarded talent, because he understood the dreams and fears of those beneath him. That emotional awareness gave him a power no boss before him had wielded, the ability to make men feel chosen. That feeling, of belonging, of being important, became another layer of loyalty. To outsiders, it appeared that Luciano was simply tightening the rules. But in truth he was reforming the entire culture of the Mafia. He transformed omerta from an outdated oath into a living system that breathed with ambition, fear, reward, and consequence. This shift created stability the Mafia had never known. With clearer expectations and stronger incentives, betrayals decreased. Internal wars quieted. Decision-making became streamlined. The organization functioned less like a violent collection of egos and more like a disciplined corporation. Every empire needs a backbone. For Luciano's, this reimagined code became that backbone. The irony is that Luciano respected the concept of omerta more than many of the old bosses ever did. They revered it as ritual, he treated it as strategy. They clung to its myth, he understood its function. They believed the past defined it, he believed the future required it to evolve. Under his influence, loyalty changed from a promise whispered in the dark to a weapon wielded in the everyday operations of crime. It became a tool that kept the empire cohesive, profitable, and unchallenged. It became the invisible force that held the commission together. It became the silent engine behind every alliance he created. Luciano didn't break omerta. He reinvented it. And in doing so, he gave himself the most powerful weapon any leader could possess: control over the hearts, minds, and fates of the men who served under him. By the time Lucky Luciano began shaping the underworld into a machine of efficiency, one truth had become undeniable. Crime, when done correctly, could function like an industry. It could be organized, structured, predictable. And where others saw illegal operations as scattered hustles, Luciano saw an entire economic landscape waiting to be systematized. He didn't view crime as a series of dangerous ventures. He viewed it as business, complex, scalable, and capable of generating unimaginable wealth if managed with discipline. This shift in thinking would redefine the American Mafia forever. Bootlegging during Prohibition had already shown Luciano the potential of large-scale illegal enterprise. Liquor distribution wasn't just profitable, it was a logistical challenge involving supply chains, transport routes, bribery networks, and distribution channels. Most gangs handled it sloppily. They fought over shipments, double-crossed partners, and allowed rivalry to consume profit. Lucky watched the chaos closely, and in that chaos he saw opportunity. In his mind, criminal operations needed structure. They needed departments, oversight, and delegation. They needed consistency, not impulse. Crime should operate not on rage or pride, but on data, planning, and strategy. And so he began building what was, in essence, an underground corporation. To expand this empire, he focused on three core pillars: gambling, racketeering, and prostitution. Each market was already lucrative, but under Luciano, they became integrated systems rather than isolated ventures. Gambling was the first to undergo transformation. Illegal gambling dens were everywhere in New York, but most were unregulated, inefficient, and prone to police raids. Luciano brought organization to the chaos. He partnered with experts, bookmakers who understood odds, financiers who understood risk, and enforcers who ensured compliance. With Lansky's mathematical precision, they built gambling networks that stretched far beyond local neighborhoods. Money flowed upward through carefully designed channels, each man taking his cut, each operation recorded in meticulous ledgers. For the first time, the Mafia had reliable revenue. Prostitution, though already widespread, was equally chaotic. Pimp-controlled women, violent handlers, unpredictable street operations, it was a business that consumed itself. Luciano did not moralize, he industrialized. He removed the unstable individuals who caused police attention and replaced them with managers who understood how to maintain order. Women were rotated, protected from police crackdowns with strategic bribery, and placed in brothels that operated more like quiet commercial establishments than seedy back-alley traps. The profits multiplied, and with them Luciano's control expanded. Racketeering, the manipulation of unions, labor industries, and protection schemes, became his most sophisticated enterprise. This was where the Mafia's influence reached into legitimate American life. Construction, trucking, docks, the garment district. Luciano understood that controlling these industries meant controlling the cities themselves. And he did not approach union infiltration like a thug. He approached it like a strategist. Union bosses were put on payrolls. Strikes were orchestrated or prevented based on financial interest. Companies paid not just for protection, but for stability, ensuring their operations ran uninterrupted. The Mafia became a shadow government regulating entire sectors of the workforce. The brilliance of it was in its simplicity. If someone wanted to move goods, hire workers, or transport supplies, they eventually had to deal with Luciano's network. Every layer of the criminal economy was connected to every other. And because Luciano had engineered loyalty through opportunity, each man in the chain remained invested in the system's survival. No one wanted to betray a business that fed them, protected them, and elevated them. But what truly separated Luciano from other criminals was his ability to outsource and delegate. He wasn't obsessed with control for control's sake. He wanted efficiency. He wanted scale. He wanted operations that continued functioning even when he wasn't present. Where other bosses micromanaged through fear, he empowered through structure. Tasks were assigned to people who had proven loyalty and competence. Territories were managed like branches of a company. Major decisions flowed through the commission, a council he helped create, ensuring no single conflict threatened the stability of the entire organization. The creation of the commission itself was a masterstroke. Instead of one boss ruling with absolute authority, the underworld now had a governing body, a board of directors that addressed disputes, divided territories, and maintained order. Through it, Luciano ensured that no one man, especially not an impulsive, ego-driven warlord, could destroy everything he had built. The commission wasn't just a symbol of unity, it was an engine of control. This structure allowed Luciano's criminal business to expand beyond New York. Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans, each city became a node in a national network. Illegal goods flowed smoothly. Money traveled with purpose. Communication lines were established. And because Luciano had forged alliances with different ethnic groups, there were no artificial barriers holding the system back. He had effectively created America's first multi-ethnic criminal corporation. His brilliance also lay in how he used legitimate fronts to mask illegal income. Nightclubs, restaurants, taxi companies, construction firms, these were not just businesses. They were pipelines for laundering money, for hiding transactions, for generating legitimate influence with politicians and law enforcement. Luciano understood that power didn't come just from guns or fear. Real power came from blending into the fabric of society so seamlessly that pulling him out would tear the fabric itself. Behind the scenes, he monitored everything, not with paranoia but with precision. Reports came in daily. Financial updates, arrest warnings, alliance negotiations. His network stretched across states, and yet he could sense the movement of every major piece. He was a criminal CEO, operating at a level far beyond the imagination of the old Sicilian bosses. What he built wasn't a gang. It wasn't even a syndicate. It was an empire. An empire that ran like a business, moved like a machine, and generated wealth with the efficiency of a corporation. But success at this scale comes at a cost. As the business grew, so did the threats. Competitors envied him. Law enforcement noticed him. Rivals wanted his influence. And internally, ambition simmered among those who wondered whether they too could rise. For now, however, Luciano stood at the peak of criminal innovation, a man who had turned the chaos of the underworld into the business of crime. Quietly, methodically, he had transformed a legal enterprise into an industry. And industries, once created, take on a life of their own. As Lucky Luciano's empire expanded, so did the cast of figures orbiting around him. Some drawn by opportunity, some by fear, some by ambition too dangerous to ignore. In the underworld he helped rebuild. Allies and enemies were often the same men at different moments in time. A handshake today could become a death sentence tomorrow. A smile across the table might hide a plan already in motion. Power attracts loyalty, but it also attracts predators. Luciano understood this duality better than anyone. He knew that alliances were never permanent. They were agreements held together by mutual benefit and constant negotiation. He trusted no one completely, not even his closest partners. Yet he understood that total isolation was the fastest route to destruction. Every powerful man must walk with allies, but always with one eye open. Among those closest to him, Meyer Lansky remained the most dependable. Lansky wasn't just a friend. He was the quiet strategist who balanced Luciano's instincts with calculation. If Lucky was the heart of the operation, Lansky was the brain. Together, they formed a bond that was almost unbreakable, built not on sentiment but on shared vision. Lansky would never challenge Luciano's authority, and Luciano trusted him more than any man alive. Their alliance stood as the model for how relationships should function in the new underworld. Efficient, intelligent, mutually beneficial. Bugsy Siegel, on the other hand, was both an asset and a danger. He was loyal in the way a storm is loyal to the direction of the wind. Charismatic, fearless, unpredictable, Bugsy had a talent for making money and an equal talent for making enemies. Luciano valued him for his courage and his ability to intimidate, but he also knew Bugsy's explosive temper could ignite conflicts at the worst possible times. Bugsy was a weapon, powerful and deadly, but a weapon that sometimes fired without warning. Then there were the Italian bosses, men of the old tradition, who watched Luciano's rise with a mixture of admiration and fear. Some saw him as the future. Others saw him as a threat to everything they believed in. Men like Frank Costello aligned themselves early, sensing that Luciano's leadership meant stability and profit. Costello, sophisticated and politically connected, became the diplomat of Luciano's world, the man who could enter rooms Lucky couldn't, speaking with senators, police chiefs, and businessmen. Their alliance strengthened the bridge between the criminal and legitimate worlds. But not all relationships were so harmonious. Vito Genovese, ambitious, sly, and patient, stood among those who cooperated while quietly calculating their own ascent. Genovese respected Luciano outwardly, but inwardly, he believed he should one day sit in the chair Lucky held. He had the brutality, the fearlessness, and the hunger, but not the charisma or the subtlety. Their alliance was uneasy, built on necessity, destined to become volatile as both men rose in power. And looming like a dark shadow over everything was Salvatore Maranzano, the last Caesar. A boss from Sicily who saw himself as a Roman-era warlord brought into the modern age. He admired discipline and hierarchy but despised innovation. He craved absolute power and viewed Luciano's alliances with Jewish and Irish partners as an insult to tradition. For Maranzano, loyalty was ethnic, sacred, unbreakable. For Luciano it was functional. Their philosophies were too different to coexist. Their alliance, if it could be called one, was temporary from the moment it began. Maranzano wanted obedience. Luciano wanted cooperation. Maranzano wanted control. Luciano wanted efficiency. The collision between them was inevitable. Enemy lines, however, were rarely clear. Many men shifted positions depending on profit. Some played both sides. Others pledged loyalty to Luciano while secretly hoping he would fail. Rival gangs in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the outer boroughs continued probing for weaknesses in his empire. Government investigators watched quietly from the sidelines, gathering intel, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the most dangerous enemies were not external, they were internal. Jealousy grew in the hearts of those who felt overshadowed by Luciano's brilliance. Suspicion spread in the whispers exchanged in backrooms, where lesser bosses wondered whether Luciano's rapid rise meant he was destined to rule them all. Power, especially centralized power, creates fear. And fear breeds betrayal. Lucky never underestimated this. He spent as much time managing relationships as he did managing business. He listened carefully, spoke softly, and made sure every man believed he had a place in the future he was building. He rewarded loyalty generously. He punished disobedience quietly. He removed threats before they grew teeth. His genius was not in eliminating enemies but in turning potential enemies into temporary allies, and temporary allies into dependable partners. Still, even he could not escape the truth. In a world built on ambition, every ally carries the seed of rivalry. And yet, alliances also gave him unprecedented strength. When conflicts arose, and they did constantly, Luciano had the largest support network in the underworld. When he needed forces, they appeared. When he needed money, it flowed. When he needed silence, it fell like a curtain. His alliances were both shield and spear, protecting him from threats and allowing him to strike with precision. He had created a network so vast that even government agencies found it hard to understand, let alone penetrate. Police commissioners, judges, union leaders, politicians, all were connected to someone in Luciano's sphere. Power moved through this network like electricity, invisible yet undeniable. But the stronger he became, the more tension simmered. The old guard felt threatened. The ambitious felt confined. The outsiders he welcomed became targets of resentment. Every advance forward upset someone somewhere. The stage was set for conflict, deep, fatal conflict. And in the world Lucky Luciano built, allies and enemies often stood so close that a single breath could turn partnership into war. The alliances that elevated him would soon be the same alliances tested by fear, greed, and the unending hunger for power that defined the criminal world. The underworld was changing, and with it, the loyalties that kept it together. Some would hold, some would shatter. And Luciano would stand in the center of it all, balancing friendship and danger with the precision of a man who knew that one wrong move could cost him everything. The underworld Luciano built was powerful, too powerful to exist without resistance. As his influence spread across cities and industries, a hidden war ignited beneath the surface. It was a war fought not with open declarations, but with whispers, coded messages, and shadows slipping into the night. Every empire creates opposition. Every structure creates cracks. And Lucky Luciano now stood at the center of a battlefield that stretched far beyond anything the old Mafia had ever encountered. Government pressure was mounting. The Prohibition era, which had once shielded criminals with its widespread corruption and shared profit, was now beginning to shift. Federal agencies, embarrassed by years of unchecked criminal growth, started to take organized crime seriously. Senators demanded investigations. Journalists published exposés. Police departments, once easy to bribe, began facing scrutiny from the public and from new watchdog organizations. To them, Luciano represented the enemy they needed to defeat to justify their own existence. But while the government moved slowly and clumsily, the more immediate threats came from within the underworld itself. Beneath Luciano's calm, organized exterior, the criminal world was rumbling. Rival factions resented his influence. Old bosses feared his modernization. Young gangsters envied his control. And certain men like Maranzano and Genovese, were beginning to position themselves for something far darker, a chance to seize the empire Lucky had built. To maintain order, Luciano relied heavily on a force that operated behind the scenes, a group unlike anything the Mafia had ever seen before. Murder Incorporated was the quiet engine of fear that fueled Luciano's stability. It was an enforcement squad made up largely of Jewish killers, many handpicked by Lansky and Siegel. They were efficient, disciplined, and terrifyingly professional. They executed contracts across the country with precision, leaving no witnesses, no loose ends, no hesitation. They were the invisible executioners of the commission, the shadow guardians of Luciano's new order. But their existence also deepened the hidden war. Murder Incorporated terrified not only enemies but allies. It gave Luciano and the commission a reach that made even the most defiant bosses think twice before crossing him. It shifted the balance of power dramatically and violently. Each quiet assassination echoed through the underworld like an unspoken instruction: follow the new order or be removed from it. And yet, while Murder Incorporated secured Luciano's rule, it also created vulnerabilities. The more bodies that fell, the more government interest grew. Detectives began connecting patterns. Reporters speculated about a centralized killing machine. Prosecutors whispered the names of men they believed were behind the organization. Luciano had built a system of deterrence, but the very strength of that system threatened to expose him. At the same time, internal mafia disputes began testing the unity Luciano had worked so hard to build. In cities across the country, territorial clashes erupted. Some small, some catastrophic. Bootlegging routes were attacked. Gambling operations were hijacked. Labor rackets became battlegrounds between ambitious lieutenants eager for a larger share. Luciano tried to mediate, using the commission to enforce decisions, but even the commission had its limits. Too many egos. Too much money. Too much ambition. The war was not always violent. Much of it was psychological, a quiet contest of influence, manipulation, and information. Luciano relied on spies within his own ranks, men who reported which capos were whispering against him, which allies were growing restless, which enemies were meeting in secret. Trust became an increasingly scarce resource. Even men Luciano had known since childhood now required careful watching. He found himself making decisions faster and with greater intensity than ever before. Should he remove this man? Should he reward that one? Should he intervene in a territorial conflict or let the fighting weaken both sides? Leadership had become a daily chess match. Every move had consequences and every victory came with a new threat. Meanwhile, prohibition was ending. The golden river of illegal liquor, once the backbone of his fortune, was drying up. Without bootlegging profits, the underworld needed new sources of income. Some factions adapted quickly, shifting into drugs, gambling, and labor racketeering. Others panicked, reverting to disorganized violence as their revenue collapsed. Economic instability created tension, and tension created danger. Law enforcement seized the moment. Raids increased. Surveillance improved. Investigators began targeting the financial flows that kept the mafia alive. Luciano had operated for years believing he was untouchable, protected by alliances, bribes, and political favors. But now the walls were closing in. Detectives who once backed away now pushed forward aggressively, determined to uncover the connections that tied union bosses, politicians, and criminal figures to Luciano's network. Every criminal empire reaches a point where survival requires more than strategy. It requires resilience, sacrifice, and sometimes brutality. Luciano understood this better than anyone. In response to growing pressure, he moved more quietly, more carefully. Meetings were relocated. Messages traveled through trusted couriers. Operations were disguised behind legitimate businesses. The hidden war was tightening, forcing him to adapt. But the greatest threat was still the one closest to him: the ambitions of his own associates. Vito Genovese had begun positioning himself for the future, building alliances separate from Luciano's, whispering promises to men who felt overlooked. Maranzano, still clinging to dreams of dictatorial power, secretly plotted Luciano's elimination, believing the new order was a betrayal of Sicilian tradition. Their conspiracies moved in the dark, gaining traction with every passing week. Luciano sensed the shift. He felt the change in tone during meetings, noticed the hesitation in certain men's greetings, the evasiveness in their answers. The hidden war was no longer just a distant threat, it was creeping into his inner circle. And as the pressure intensified, from the government, from rivals, from allies who might become enemies, Lucky Luciano faced a truth that every powerful leader must face. A system built on loyalty must constantly defend itself from those waiting for it to falter. The hidden war was no longer in the shadows. It was rising toward the surface, ready to erupt into a conflict that would reshape Luciano's life, and the entire underworld, forever. The fall of an empire never starts with a single blow. It begins with small fractures, quiet shifts in loyalty, and a slow tightening of forces waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For Lucky Luciano, the beginning of that fall came not through a gunshot or a betrayal whispered in a dark alley, but through pressure, steady, unrelenting pressure, from a world that had finally decided to push back. Law enforcement, which Luciano had controlled for years through bribes and influence, had begun to change. A new generation of prosecutors rose through the ranks. Men less interested in money and more interested in making names for themselves. They saw organized crime not as an unstoppable force but as a challenge. They saw Luciano not as a myth but as a target that could elevate their careers. Among them, one name would define Luciano's downfall: District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey was young, ambitious, and determined to tear the criminal world apart piece by piece. He studied Luciano's empire the way a surgeon studies a tumor, mapping arteries, examining weaknesses, attempting to understand how something so vast and hidden could exist in plain sight. While other prosecutors chased bootleggers or small-time gangsters, Dewey aimed directly for the top. His sights were set on Luciano from the beginning. But Dewey wasn't the only threat. Luciano's internal world was shifting in ways he could no longer control. The commission, once the symbol of unity and stability, was now a stage for unspoken resentments. Territorial disputes grew messier. Financial disagreements created silent hostility. Some bosses felt Luciano had grown too powerful, too influential. They whispered that he had become the very dictator he once fought against. And then there was Vito Genovese. Genovese, fueled by ambition and possessive jealousy, believed he was destined to replace Luciano. He saw Dewey's growing interest in organized crime as an opportunity. Rumors spread that Genovese had begun feeding information to investigators, never directly, never openly, but through intermediaries, through calculated leaks. Nothing was ever proven, but in the Mafia, truth and suspicion often carry the same weight. The mere possibility of betrayal changed everything. Luciano sensed the shift in the air. Meetings felt colder. Conversations shorter. Eyes lingered too long or avoided him entirely. Trust, the very weapon he once wielded so effectively, began slipping through his fingers. But the blow that changed everything didn't come from the Mafia. It came from the streets, from the very industry that had made him richer than anyone before him: prostitution. For years, Luciano's organization had controlled a massive prostitution network, one of the largest in the country. It had always operated in the shadows, protected by bribes and silence. But Dewey targeted it ruthlessly. Raids intensified. Brothels were shut down. Women were arrested, interrogated, threatened with long prison terms if they didn't cooperate. One by one they broke. The code of omerta meant nothing to them. They were not Mafia. They had no loyalty to protect. Many had been abused, exploited, discarded. Dewey offered them something they had never been given: a voice. And that voice became the instrument that would bring down Lucky Luciano. In courtroom after courtroom, women testified, some truthfully, some under pressure, some embellishing stories to gain favor. Their words painted Luciano as the mastermind behind a sprawling vice empire. They described beatings, threats, payments handed to pimps who claimed to answer directly to him. None of the testimony could prove he had personally managed the operations. But in the court of public opinion, details didn't matter. A monster had been found. Dewey built his case meticulously, stacking witness upon witness, constructing a narrative that portrayed Luciano as the architect of exploitation across the city. Lawyers argued. Journalists sensationalized. The public, desperate to believe corruption had a face, embraced the story. Behind closed doors, Luciano raged, not in emotion but in calculation. He knew the charges were exaggerated, possibly even fabricated. But he also knew the most dangerous part. His enemies within the Mafia would not risk their own exposure by defending him. The alliances he once strengthened now remained silent. Even his closest partners could not intervene. Interference with the government now carried a risk none were willing to take. And then the final betrayal came quietly. One of his own lieutenants agreed to testify. Whether out of fear, pressure, or self-preservation, it didn't matter. The damage was irreversible. As the trial progressed, Luciano watched the walls close around him. He had survived gang wars, assassination attempts, internal coups, and hidden conspiracies. But this was the slow suffocation of a system he could not intimidate, bribe, or control. Dewey was relentless, and Luciano understood that his enemies were not just outside the courtroom. Some were sitting at the commission table. Some were sitting in his own crews. Some were in the shadows, waiting to claim the throne the moment he was removed. The fall began not with noise but with quiet realization. The empire he had built so meticulously was turning against him. Not out of hatred but out of survival. In the underworld, power is oxygen. And without it, even legends begin to suffocate. As the trial reached its climax, Luciano felt the inevitable truth pressing down on him. His rise had been built on alliances, loyalty, and innovation. His downfall would be built on those same elements, twisted into weapons against him. The man who once controlled the underworld now stood in a courtroom, surrounded by strangers, betrayed by allies, hunted by prosecutors, and crushed by a system he once believed he could navigate forever. The fall had begun. And there was no going back. The courtroom became a theater, and Lucky Luciano, once the unseen architect of the American underworld, was thrust into the spotlight as its unwilling star. Reporters flooded the hallways, sketch artists filled notebooks with his likeness, and spectators lined up as if attending a Broadway premiere. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when the most powerful mob figure in America would finally be confronted by the law he had long evaded. His trial was not merely a legal proceeding, it was a national spectacle. Lucky entered the courtroom with the same calm composure he carried in the streets. Impeccably dressed, expression unreadable, he sat at the defense table as if attending a business meeting rather than fighting for his freedom. Cameras flashed. Journalists whispered. His silence became part of the performance. Calculated, controlled, almost unnervingly confident. But beneath that surface, even he understood that this trial was unlike any enemy he had ever faced. This enemy played by rules he couldn't manipulate. The prosecution, led by the fiercely determined Thomas E. Dewey, approached the case with precision. Dewey spoke with a controlled intensity, walking the jury through a narrative that painted Luciano not as a businessman or a negotiator, but as a tyrant commanding a vast web of vice. He described a world where women were commodities, where violence enforced compliance, where money flowed upward to a single mastermind, the man seated across from him. Luciano watched him calmly, but each word landed like a stone sinking into still water, quiet but inevitable. Witness after witness took the stand, and each testimony chipped away at the legend Lucky had built. Women who once feared speaking his name now pointed a finger at him before the nation. Some cried. Some trembled. Some delivered rehearsed statements fed to them by prosecutors desperate to break the code of silence surrounding organized crime. They spoke about brutal pimps, about pressure, about a structure they barely understood but had been coached to describe. Most had never met Luciano. Many had never been in the same room with him. But Dewey didn't need direct ties. He needed a story the jury could believe, a narrative that turned Luciano into the invisible puppeteer of their suffering. And the jury believed. Lines blurred between fact and accusation, between truth and convenient fiction. The public wanted a villain and Dewey presented one. Headlines turned Luciano into a monstrous symbol of human exploitation. Editorials declared the trial a moral crusade. Politicians demanded an example be made. In the court of public opinion, Lucky had already lost. His defense attorneys fought hard, arguing that the testimonies were unreliable, that no evidence tied Luciano to direct management of prostitution. They pointed out contradictions, inconsistencies, the absence of financial records or eyewitness confirmation. But the courtroom was no longer a place of law, it had become an arena for symbolism. Dewey wasn't just prosecuting Luciano. He was prosecuting the entire concept of organized crime. And Luciano, with all his influence and infamy, was the perfect sacrifice. As the trial continued, Luciano's allies watched with growing discomfort. Few dared to intervene. Even those who owed him their fortunes knew that standing against Dewey's crusade could expose them, implicate them, ruin them. The commission remained eerily silent. Men who once pledged loyalty suddenly found pressing business elsewhere. Luciano was alone, not because they hated him but because his downfall served the survival of everyone else. The turning point came when one of Luciano's own associates testified against him, weaving a story that connected Lucky directly to the prostitution network. Whether the testimony was coerced or voluntary, it didn't matter. In the eyes of the jury, loyalty had shattered. If a man from Luciano's inner circle could implicate him, then the case must be legitimate. The damage was irreversible. Luciano maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal, but the psychological toll was immense. To a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, the courtroom became a prison of unpredictability. Every question, every witness, every objection carried weight he could not counter. He was a strategist placed in a game where strategy no longer mattered. The final statement sealed his fate. Dewey stood before the jury with the confidence of a man who knew victory was imminent. He framed Luciano not as one criminal among many, but as the mastermind of moral corruption in America. He invoked the suffering of women, the fear in their voices, the need for justice. By the time he finished, the jury was no longer deciding on legal guilt, they were deciding what kind of society they wanted to live in. When the verdict came, the room felt suspended in silence. Guilty. On 62 counts. Luciano listened without flinching, but those close enough could see a change in his eyes, a moment of realization, cold and sharp. For the first time in his life, luck had not been on his side. The courtroom exploded with reactions, gasps, whispers, triumphant nods. Dewey, calm but visibly satisfied, shook hands with his team. Reporters rushed out to file the story. And Luciano, escorted by officers, walked with the dignity of a man unwilling to let the world see him break. The sentence was severe, 30 to 50 years in prison. A punishment designed not just to confine him, but to erase him from the underworld he had shaped. In that single moment his empire cracked. Men who once aligned themselves under his authority now sensed opportunity. Rivals sharpened their ambitions. Allies repositioned themselves. Power, like water, began shifting toward empty spaces. The courtroom doors closed behind him. And Lucky Luciano, king of the American underworld, entered a new chapter he had never imagined. A life stripped of control, defined not by influence but by confinement. The fall had not just begun. It had struck with full force. Prison was supposed to break him. 30 to 50 years behind bars was meant to erase his presence from the streets, dismantle his influence, and send a message that even the most powerful mob boss could be reduced to nothing. But the walls that confined most men did not confine Lucky Luciano. If anything, prison revealed the depth of the empire he had built. It proved that his power was not tied to streets or territories, it lived in people, in systems, in loyalties he had engineered long before stepping into a cell. From the moment he arrived, it became clear that Luciano was not entering captivity as a defeated man. Guards recognized him. Inmates whispered his name. Even officials who had helped secure his conviction understood that the man they were locking away was not just another criminal. He was an institution, a figure who could not be handled like ordinary prisoners. His presence carried gravity, an aura that made even the most hardened convicts pause before speaking to him. Luciano adapted quickly, not by intimidating those around him, but by doing what he always did best: reading the environment, understanding the power dynamics, and positioning himself exactly where he needed to be. He was polite, calm, observant. He followed rules without appearing submissive. He never showed frustration, never revealed fear. This disciplined behavior earned him quiet respect from guards who had expected arrogance or aggression. But the real power came from the outside. The criminal world did not stop moving simply because Luciano was behind bars. His networks continued operating, the same way any corporation would continue functioning when its CEO traveled abroad. Messages were smuggled in and out with surprising efficiency. Visitors, some legitimate, some disguised as legal counsel or business associates, brought him updates on operations, disputes, finances. And though he would never again walk freely through the streets of New York, his influence echoed through them like a distant but commanding voice. Frank Costello, ever the diplomat, stepped into the role of acting leader, ensuring stability and maintaining alliances. Myers Lansky remained the financial architect, making sure the money flowed cleanly and efficiently. Even Bugsy Siegel, uncontrollable as he was, respected the hierarchy and continued to act in Luciano's name when necessary. The empire didn't crumble. It reorganized. Luciano didn't rule with fear from inside prison. He ruled with memory. The memory of what he had built, the memory of what he had done for those who now carried the torch. Loyalty, as he had designed it, wasn't conditional on proximity. It didn't vanish when the boss disappeared. It was structural, engineered into the very foundation of the network. Yet the man behind bars was not unaffected by captivity. There were nights when the silence pressed against him like a weight. Nights when he thought about the choices that led him here, the alliances, the betrayals, the arrogance of believing he could outsmart the entire nation. But even in those moments of reflection, there was no regret in him. Only calculation. Only planning. Because Luciano never believed prison was his final destination. He believed, as he always had, that every situation contained leverage. And he would find it. That leverage arrived in the form of war. When World War II erupted, America found itself suddenly concerned about national security, espionage, and the vulnerability of its ports. German submarines lurked along the East Coast. Ships exploded mysteriously in New York Harbor. Panic spread through military intelligence. And someone in the government realized a truth no one wanted to say aloud. The man who knew the docks better than anyone, the man who controlled the unions, the flows of goods, the whisper lines of information, was sitting in a prison cell in upstate New York. Luciano, even behind bars, became a figure of strategic interest. Officials approached him quietly, cautiously. They needed help ensuring that the docks remained secure, that sabotage could be prevented, that information flowed to the right people at the right time. And Luciano, with the same careful confidence he once used in negotiating underworld alliances, agreed. Not out of patriotism, though he spoke of loyalty to America as the country that raised him, but out of understanding the opportunity before him. This collaboration, later known as Operation Underworld, blurred the line between criminal and patriot. It proved one thing clearly: Luciano still held a kind of authority that even the government could not ignore. His ability to mobilize people, to command loyalty, to influence territories he hadn't seen in years. These were powers no prison sentence could contain. Inside the walls, news traveled fast. Inmates whispered that Lucky had made a deal. Guards looked at him with a new mix of suspicion and respect. And Luciano, never boastful, simply continued his routine, quiet, composed, calculating. His influence did not come from threats or demands. It came from presence. Even in isolation, he radiated leadership. Men sought him out for advice. Disputes inside the prison sometimes came to him for resolution. He was not an inmate living among criminals. He was a king exiled to a smaller kingdom. But exile does not erase a crown. The reality was simple. Lucky Luciano was never truly powerless, because his power had never depended on freedom. His empire lived in minds, in networks, in structures built long before the prison gates closed behind him. And as the war continued and whispers of government cooperation grew louder, one truth emerged: the man they tried to bury was still commanding from the shadows. Behind bars, Lucky Luciano remained what he had always been: a strategist, a leader, and a force the world could not easily silence. When the day finally came for Lucky Luciano to leave prison, it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like an ending disguised as a beginning. After years behind bars, after cooperating quietly with U.S. intelligence during the war, he received the one reward he had never expected: commutation. But it came with a cruel condition. He would be deported, permanently removed from the country he had helped reshape in both crime and commerce. The land where he built his empire would no longer belong to him. America had used him, and now America was done with him. The ship that carried him across the Atlantic felt like a coffin drifting toward its burial place. He stood on deck watching the coastline fade into a thin silver line, the skyline of New York shrinking until it became nothing but memory. For the first time in his life, Luciano understood what exile truly meant: not just being removed from a place but being removed from relevance. Power, influence, control, these things were rooted in proximity. And now the world he once ruled continued without him. Italy welcomed him with caution, not admiration. To some, he was a relic of American corruption. To others, he was a dangerous foreign boss whose presence threatened to disrupt long-standing local structures. The Sicilian Mafia did not bow to him. They tolerated him. They respected his past, but not enough to offer him command. He was powerful but out of place. A king without a throne. The streets of Naples, where he eventually settled, were nothing like the polished chaos of Manhattan. Here, poverty clung to every alley, and post-war desperation created a different kind of criminal landscape, one he neither fully understood nor entirely respected. But Luciano adapted as he always had. He made connections, built relationships, and watched quietly from the shadows. His influence would never again reach the scale it once had, but his presence alone carried weight. Men sought him out for advice. Others courted him, hoping to borrow some of the prestige attached to his name. Yet, beneath the surface, something had changed. Luciano was older now, and with age came a kind of reflective distance. The man who once strategized with ruthless clarity now spent long nights staring from balconies overlooking the water, the glow of cigarettes marking the slow tempo of his thoughts. He replayed moments of his life as if watching an old film. Alliances forged, betrayals endured, victories won, enemies eliminated. But the scenes no longer filled him with triumph or pride. They simply existed, like artifacts of a world he could no longer touch. Still, he did not retreat completely. Even in exile, Luciano remained a figure of immense significance. He played a subtle role in the global heroin trade, connecting networks across Europe and America. He never handled the operations directly, but his approval, his mediation, his connections, all were invaluable. In many ways, he had become an advisor rather than a commander, a strategist whose ideas traveled farther than his feet ever could. But exile carried a deeper price: the slow erosion of identity. The underworld he helped build evolved without him. New bosses rose, men who had never met him, who saw him as history rather than authority. Old allies died, retired, or turned on each other. The commission continued operating, but its dynamics shifted. The world he once shaped into an empire now moved on, indifferent to the man who had architected its foundation. Luciano tried to maintain relevance. He attended meetings in Cuba, seeking to reinsert himself into the center of organized crime, but American pressure forced him out again. The message was clear: the world had changed and there was no longer space for him to rule it. He was admired but not obeyed, respected but not feared, remembered but not needed. This realization settled into him slowly, painfully. Power had defined him for so long that living without it felt like shedding a part of his own skin. And yet, there was something almost humanizing in the loss. Deprived of his empire, he began to reflect on the cost of its creation. The alliances he had built had changed history, but they had also destroyed men. The code he reinvented had brought order, but it had also demanded blood. The life he shaped for himself required sacrifices he could never reclaim. In Naples, he became a man living between two worlds, the legend and the exile. Tourists sought him out. Journalists wrote about him. Young gangsters whispered his name with reverence. But the man himself sat alone in cafes, his once sharp eyes softened by time. He was not broken. Lucky Luciano was never a man who broke, but he was unmistakably altered. There were nights when he dreamed of New York, the electric glow of Times Square, the murmur of crowded streets, the backrooms where decisions shaped entire cities. He imagined walking those streets unseen, blending into the crowds like a ghost revisiting the world he built. In those moments he felt both proud and profoundly empty. Exile had taken from him the one thing he could never rebuild: presence. His end came quietly, fitting for a man who once lived so loudly. He died alone in an airport lobby, waiting to meet a producer interested in making a film about his life. Even in his final hours he was negotiating legacy, shaping the narrative of his myth. When he collapsed, there was no war, no enemy, no betrayal, only silence. In exile, Lucky Luciano discovered the final truth of power: that even the strongest men must one day stand without it. And in that solitude he faced the man behind the myth, the strategist, the leader, the survivor, and the human being who had spent his entire life chasing a throne that ultimately vanished from beneath him. His end was not dramatic. It was reflective. A quiet curtain closing on a life lived in the fire of ambition, loyalty, and consequence. History rarely remembers men the way they truly were. It remembers what it wants: the myth, the legend, the silhouette cast on the wall. And Lucky Luciano's silhouette, shaped by fear, respect, innovation, and controversy, has grown far larger than the man who once walked the streets of New York. Decades after his death, his influence continues to move through the world like a faint vibration beneath the surface, felt but not always recognized. His methods, his structures, and his philosophy still echo in every corner where organized crime exists. Luciano's legacy begins with the simplest truth: he did not invent the Mafia, but he reinvented it. Before him, it was chaos wrapped in tradition, a fractured network of families bound by honor but weakened by ego. After him, it became a system, a corporation, a machine with moving parts, governed not by superstition but by strategy. His creation of the Commission alone transformed the underworld from a collection of warring tribes into a national force capable of coordinating actions across states and decades. In many ways, he did for organized crime what industrial leaders did for American business. He streamlined it, unified it, and scaled it. But Luciano's influence extended far beyond logistics or hierarchy. He reshaped the psychology of power in the criminal world. He understood that loyalty was not an abstract virtue, but a tool to be sharpened, measured, and deployed. The weaponization of loyalty, through shared profit, shared secrets, and shared risk, became the cornerstone of modern organized crime. His model ensured that power didn't collapse the moment a leader disappeared. It created continuity, sustainability, and resilience. Even after prison. Even after exile. Even after death. Criminal empires today, Italian, Russian, Mexican, even corporate-style networks in cyberspace, still mirror the structures Luciano engineered. Multi-ethnic alliances, revenue diversification, decentralized leadership, conflict mediation councils. These are concepts that seem modern, even corporate. But their seeds were planted by Luciano at a time when no one else could imagine such solutions. His genius was not just in understanding people, but in understanding systems. Yet, where there is legacy, there is also darkness. Luciano's methods brought order, but they also brought violence. Violence executed with efficiency, with precision, with an almost bureaucratic coldness. Murder Incorporated became the embodiment of this paradox. Order through brutality, stability through fear. The psychological distance Luciano maintained between himself and violence did not absolve him, it amplified him. He created a world where killing became operational, not emotional. And that shift changed the ethical fabric of organized crime forever. His story also carries the weight of moral contradictions. He was a man who believed in structure, yet built that structure on extortion and exploitation. He believed in loyalty yet manipulated it. He believed in opportunity, but often for men who chose power over humanity. There is an uncomfortable brilliance in his design, a brilliance that cannot be praised without acknowledging the suffering it enabled. Still, to understand Luciano's legacy, one must look at the broader canvas. He emerged from a world where poverty bred desperation, where immigrants were treated as outsiders, where survival demanded creativity and ruthlessness. He didn't choose his battlefield, he mastered it. And in mastering it, he changed the rules for everyone who came after him. Modern criminologists study his methods the way business schools study Rockefeller or Carnegie. Intelligence agencies study his networks to understand the evolution of global cartels. Psychologists analyze his leadership to decode the mechanics of charismatic control. Even filmmakers and storytellers find endless fascination in the duality of his existence. The man who could negotiate $1 million deal with calm elegance, and in the same hour, order the quiet removal of a threat. But beyond strategy and influence lies the more human legacy he left behind, the tragedy of ambition. Luciano spent his life chasing a pinnacle so high that the world beneath him became distorted. He gained everything: wealth, fear, respect, power, yet died alone in an airport far from the streets that once defined him. In the end, the empire he built lived on without him, and the world he shaped moved forward indifferent to the presence or absence of its creator. Perhaps that is the final paradox of Lucky Luciano. A man who controlled everything ultimately controlled nothing. A man who built an empire ultimately owned none of it. A man who engineered loyalty ultimately faced exile without anyone beside him. His legacy is not merely the empire he formed, but the lessons buried within it. Lessons about power, about leadership, about the cost of ambition, and about the fragile nature of loyalty when stretched across a lifetime of conflict. To some, Luciano remains a villain. To others, a visionary. To historians, he is a catalyst, a force that accelerated the evolution of organized crime by decades. But to the world at large, he is something more complex. A symbol of the duality of human ambition, the shadow cast when intelligence meets ruthlessness, the myth born when a man defies the boundaries of his time. Long after his death, the legacy of Lucky Luciano remains like a ghost floating between the lines of history, not heroic, not monstrous, but undeniably influential. A reminder that power, once unleashed, does not disappear. It evolves. It adapts. It continues. Just as he intended. Every story eventually returns to silence, and Lucky Luciano's story, so loud, so explosive, so influential, ends in a quiet place. Not in a courtroom, not in a shootout, not in the dark backrooms where he once shaped the fate of cities, but in the soft, reflective quiet of history looking back. His life unfolded across continents, across wars, across the evolution of the American underworld, and now, standing at the edge of that long arc, we are left to ask a single question. What remains of a man when his empire is gone? For Luciano, the answer lies in contradiction. He changed the world, but the world outgrew him. He built a system, but the system survived without him. He redefined loyalty, yet died surrounded by none of the men who once swore their lives to him. His legacy echoes not through personal triumph but through the transformation he forced upon the criminal landscape. As we step back and view the entire journey, a pattern emerges, one that reveals both brilliance and tragedy. Luciano rose from poverty not because he was the strongest or the most violent, but because he understood people. He understood hierarchy. He understood the psychology of ambition. He read human beings like other men read maps, always searching for paths, weaknesses, opportunities. That talent elevated him above the chaos of the early underworld and allowed him to construct an empire from fragments. But power built on human nature is also vulnerable to it. The same ambition he nurtured in his allies eventually grew into danger. The same loyalty he engineered could be reshaped by fear or greed. The same web that supported him became the snare that trapped him. In the end, Luciano became a victim of the very forces he once mastered. His fall was not sudden. It was a slow descent, a tightening of the world around him, a gradual erosion of control, a reminder that even the most brilliant strategist cannot escape the tides of change. He survived wars, betrayals, political battles, and imprisonment, yet he could not survive time. Time changed people. Time reshaped alliances. Time made the new generation indifferent to legends. And that is perhaps the most haunting truth. The world he built did not die with him. It kept moving, evolving, expanding. The commission continued handling disputes. Syndicates continued running operations. The structures he created became templates replicated around the world. Even after exile stripped him of relevance, even after death claimed his body, his ideas lived on. Yet in his final years, walking through the streets of Naples as a man who had once commanded nations from the shadows, Luciano carried something he had never shown in his earlier life: quiet introspection. Perhaps regret, though he would never name it. Perhaps realization that power without permanence is only a temporary flame. Perhaps acceptance that the man he once was had already died long before his body did. He never apologized for his life. He never sought forgiveness. He believed in the world he built, even if he also understood its cost. That duality followed him to the end. Part strategist, part survivor, part architect of an empire whose foundations were laid with both genius and cruelty. And so, the conclusion of his story is not a moral lesson or an easy judgment. It is a reflection, an invitation to examine the forces that shape human ambition, the shadows that accompany power, the delicate balance between leadership and tyranny. Lucky Luciano was not a hero. He was not a simple villain. He was a man who rose beyond the limits of his environment, who reshaped an entire criminal culture, and who ultimately lived long enough to see the consequences of his own brilliance. As the documentary closes, we return to the image of a lone man standing at the edge of a foreign sea, a cigarette burning between his fingers, watching waves that carry no memory of New York, no echo of the empire he once ruled. The wind blows softly. The world moves on. And the name Lucky Luciano, once spoken with fear and awe, now drifts into history as both a warning and a legacy. Because in the end, power fades. Empires crumble. But the impact a man leaves, whether through creation or destruction, innovation or manipulation, remains etched in the world he touched. Lucky Luciano's story reminds us that loyalty can build a kingdom, and the loss of it can tear one apart. That vision can elevate a man, but vision alone cannot protect him from time. That behind every myth is a human being, flawed, ambitious, brilliant, and ultimately mortal. The world remembers him not because he lived forever but because he changed things forever. And that is the final truth of Lucky Luciano's life. He shaped an empire, and the empire shaped the world. But in the quiet end he stood alone, just a man facing the horizon as history whispered his name one last time.